Welcome, everybody. Welcome. It's an absolute honor and pleasure to host Dr. Robin Mitchell as our guest speaker in the Center for Black Diaspora's Lunchtime Speaker Series. Thanks to all who have made this possible: Jennifer Gardner, the Assistant Director for the Center for Black Diaspora; Aaliyah Phillips, our Administrative Assistant; Maya Jefferson, the Center's Content Development Assistant. This Lunchtime Speaker Series has been made possible through the Center for Black Diaspora Studies, Social Transformation Research Collaborative, the Healing Justice Dialogue Series, the Women's Center, and Women's and Gender Studies, the Center for Community Health Equity, and Peace, Justice, and Conflict Studies. Now, a little about our esteemed guests. Our featured guest is Dr. Robin Mitchell, who is an associate professor of European history in the Department of History at the University of Buffalo. She is a 19th century French historian specializing in discourses about race, gender, and sexuality. Her work focuses on the white colonial fantasies, scandals, and crime imposed upon Black women's bodies and voices when they were in metropolitan French spaces. Dr. Mitchell has published numerous journal articles, and her first book, Venus Noire: Black Women and Colonial Fantasies in 19th Century France, which was published in 2020 by the University of Georgia Press, was named by the African American Intellectual History Society to the best Black history books of 2020, and by The Guardian as one of the best books about sex in 2021. Dr. Mitchell's forthcoming book will be the first biography of Suzanne Simone Baptiste, also known as Madame Toussaint Louverture, a heretofore neglected yet influential figure in the history of Blackness in Europe. And the biography will be published with Princeton University Press. She is also working on a graphic history of Suzanne with artist Jesse Jumanji. So I would like to welcome Dr. Robin Mitchell. Thank you.
It's so nice to see you all. Thank you very much for the kind welcome. And I want to start by thanking Dr. Julie Moody Freeman for arranging this visit today. I lived in Chicago for 5 years at the beginning of my academic career, which began at DePaul University. And I think it's a bit ironic now. I said when I lived in Chicago that the winters there were going to kill me. And now I live in Buffalo. So you can work that out. So today, let me make sure I'm good on time. Okay, so today I'm really happy to be able to talk to you about my research. I'm going to talk to you about both my old research and the new stuff. The new stuff, as Dr. Moody Freeman said, is a microbiography of Suzanne Simone Baptiste, wife of Haitian revolutionary Toussaint Louverture. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about how these investigations help me, and these investigations, meaning these small micro histories, which I'll explain to you in a minute, help me speak more broadly on the relationship of Black women historical figures in the Francophone world. But what I mostly hope is that I show you the ways of recovering in the archives the lives of extraordinary women like Suzanne, and how those discoveries help me articulate that in teaching about how to make Black women's lives more legible is the healing that that visibility sometimes brings. So this is what we're going to do today. I am a cultural historian of 19th century France, and I specialize in issues of race, gender, sexuality, national identity, and representation. And I tend to, because Black women's lives in the 19th century are often so opaque in the archives, focus on what I said earlier, microhistory. So microhistory is defined as a genre of history that focuses on small units of research. Sometimes it's an event, sometimes it's community, sometimes it's a person. For me, it's almost always people. And I think as I try to weave stories for you today, hope you see why microhistories are so important for my work, but how help all of us sort of think about our scholarship, right? So historian Marissa Fuentes investigates what she talks about as a mutilated historicity of enslaved women. And she defines that as the violent condition in which enslaved women appear in the archive, disfigured and violated, and how that makes the women themselves and their histories often disappear. This quote has always been an organizing principle for me and also a challenge. I thought about the women that I was finding in the archives and how they had been degraded and humiliated, and the violence that had been inflicted on their bodies. But I also thought about historians like me who are searching for what we have always been told was either invisible or non-existent in the archives themselves. And I want us to think about that and talk about that, because what I'm finding the more I do this work is that that invisibility is often produced. It's produced by people who don't want us to see ourselves, and how that can be countered in the archives. So let's start with some of the challenges that I have in doing this work. What historians are often taught to do is go to the archives. And they say that to us as if there's sort of these hallowed halls where all knowledge will be found, which is nonsense, right? But what I did have to figure out in going into the archives was how to make Blackness in France visible. And once I learned how to do that, what I realized is that the examples of representations of Blackness and Black people themselves were quite visible in French archives, right? But what I kept coming back to over and over again is, how do you look for things that you're told aren't there? And how do you deal with spaces that hide their own histories? Most important for me is, how do we search for someone no one seems to care about? So before I go forward, I need to go backward a little bit. So this is where I begin my work, and that is, how are Black bodies represented in the 18th and the 19th century in French discourse? And what I realized as I was doing this work, that that these representations are not static, and that they're changing in response to very particular events. For me, when my work starts in the 19th century, that is both with the French Revolution and, more importantly, the Haitian Revolution, right? So if the French Revolution of 1789 created upheaval for notions of citizenship and nationhood, it also raised questions about topics like, who is eligible to vote? What are the roles of Jews and Arabs and so-called others? And what role would they play in the new nation, right? What France as a nation has been much more reluctant to talk about is how everything they thought about who they were as human beings changed with the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804. Right? Saint-Domingue, as it was called at the time, had been the crown jewel in France's first colonial empire. The uprising there took the lives of more than 30,000 white Frenchmen and other Europeans, and it permanently drove the French from the island. Why is this important for me? Is because no other European power had ever suffered a defeat of such a magnitude at the hands of Black people. And Haiti remains the only nation in the world founded on the basis of a slave rebellion. And so understanding the relationship in France's colonies helped me to make sense of how Blackness was both visible in France and how it functioned. All right, so my first research trip to France, I arrived and said, I study Black people in France. And I was told, we don't have any of them here. I hope you're as disgusted by that statement as I am. And so I was going into archives, trying to understand and then trying to articulate what I was looking for. I went to the Musée Carnavalet in Paris, which is the museum for the city of Paris, and said, I'm looking for representations of Black women. And they said, yeah, we don't have those. And so my frustration was both in talking to somebody who sort of refused to understand what I was looking for, but also in myself in trying to figure out, how do I talk about this? And so in a moment of just complete dejection, I started just wandering around the museum, and I came across this painting, the Galerie du Palais Royal. And what this image illustrates is a number of women who are sex workers inside the Palais Royal. And men are talking to them and talking to their handlers on how much they cost. And I was standing in front of this image, and I saw something. So I tell all my students now, when you're looking for something and you can't find it, always look in the bottom left corner. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Do you see the woman? I can't see you nodding. So can you see where this is pointing?
Yeah.
Ah, thank you. Ah, love it when people talk to me. The Black woman that you see here, her name is Esther. And I remember the moment I saw this, because what it reminded me of is that perhaps folks aren't seeing what I'm seeing. And perhaps if they're seeing them, they don't matter to them in the same way that they mattered to me. And so after coming across this painting, I realized I can actually do the work that I'm trying to do here. I just need to look differently than the folks that I have worked with and studied up until this moment, right? And so after I saw this, I started realizing that images of Black women were everywhere. These are a couple. On the left, we have Benoit's portrait of a negress, which has been renamed recently as Portrait of Madeleine. And on the right, we have the sculpture of Capot's La Négresse. And I want you to pay attention to the idea that these women at least originally had no names. There's a scholar named Denise Morel, who in fact was able to identify Benoit's subject rather quickly and renamed this portrait after her. And I found it really interesting that the fact that Madeleine, draped in the colors of French liberty, both gazing at her viewer at the same time she's being sexually objectified by them, remained nameless for so long. And that it was through these images and other French texts that I looked at that these Black women revealed themselves to me as being a particularly rich focal point to study France and study notions of race and gender there. And this image is actually outside of one of the most important museums in Paris. So it's not a question that Black bodies don't exist. It's just that some people don't care that they do. So this work, living in Paris and starting to do my work, led me to what is ultimately became my first book, Venus Noire, Black Women in Colonial Fantasies in 19th Century France. And so what I argued was that even though that there were relatively few people of color in France after the Haitian Revolution, that images about them and discussions about them appeared repeatedly. And so that it didn't really matter how many actual bodies there were in France proper. What mattered was the work that these bodies and the voices of these women were doing for white Frenchmen and women. And I ended up focusing on 3 women. And I'm going from what I see from my left to the right. Sarah Bartman, also known as the Hottentot Venus, who was sold to an animal trainer in France and paraded semi-naked through the streets. In the middle, a young Black girl named Ulrika, who was a Senegalese child who was purchased and gifted as a house pet to a French noble family. And on the very end, Jeanne Duval, who was the common law wife of the French poet Charles Baudelaire. And so when I worked on this book, it represented a really important moment to me, both professionally and personally. And the reason I'm sharing that is because one of the things that is important to me is how this work reverberates to students like you, right? And that doing this work also taught me how to be somewhat fearless in the work that I do. And I think that that is really important. And the subject of my second book, I'm sorry, there's an ambulance driving by, was supposed to be in this book, and I'll explain to you in a minute why she wasn't there. So Suzanne was supposed to be chapter 4, and she ended up not being that. So when I was doing my research, I came across this painting. It is enormous. It is Gustave Courbet's The Painter's Studio. The artist has painted himself in the center of this. His head is cocked back, his beard is thrust forward, and everyone he knows literally is in this painting. Now I want you to go. So this is the scale of this painting. Now I want you to go to the far corner. Because what you see in the very far corner is Charles Baudelaire, who I just mentioned, reading a book. Can you see that shadow?
Yeah.
Lean in. You see the top of Baudelaire's head, you see the back of the white man, and then there's a dark line and there's a shadow. That shadow is actually Jeanne Duval, who I just mentioned, who was painted by Courbet and then erased during a fight, one of the legendary fights that she had with Baudelaire. And that shadow, for me, the shadow of a Black woman who can't be completely erased from the narrative, remains a metaphor for me of the work that I try to do. And a reminder that, again, sometimes we see what we're looking for. So that's the old work. Let's talk about the new work. So in the book, You Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington, the author Alexis Cole says in her introduction that she doesn't understand male biographers of George Washington, and she takes them to task for their rather casual disdain for Washington's wife, Martha, and for their unrelenting hammering of Washington's mother, Mary, versus who she calls the manly and virile Washington. So much so that Coe ends up devising a chart of the 28 descriptors used by Washington biographers, which ranged for the women that were attached to Washington as shrewish, slovenly, querulous, stupid, and idiotic. As Coe writes, as the story goes, George Washington becomes George Washington in spite of his mother. So, as I said, when I was working on my first book, one of the recurring themes was the way that Black women were often produced by white actors as ultimate others, including the language that was used to represent them. I don't think that thought is unfamiliar to many of us who often witness women and people of color reduced to nonsensical and animalistic terminologies to distance and ferment feelings of white and male superiority. So the woman in my next book, Suzanne Simone Baptiste Louverture, historically fared similarly. Her descriptions have been feeble-minded, fat, old, ugly, stupid, long-suffering, incessant, mute, a lioness, a happy homemaker, a laundress, a mother, and an idolizer of her husband. And it does make one think, is this person worthy of a biography? So historians have theoretically used microhistories to show us more than the so-called grand sweeps of history, right? What we claim is by narrowing our focus to magnify the small, the particular, and the local, that studies of seemingly inconsequential subjects can actually have a major impact on our understanding of history. That's often much more difficult when we're looking at the lives of Black women. In the case of Suzanne, she didn't leave much writing behind, either because she chose not to or because no one thought what she did write was important enough for them to save. And so what I determined I was going to do was write a biography, which is very difficult because most biographies are usually given to so-called great white men, people who have lots of documents and who make these huge contributions to history. And so what I'm trying to do with this new book is something I call a microbiography, which is taking the element of the small from microhistory and combining it with biography. And I hope that makes sense. And we can sort of talk about that if you want. So here we go. One always hopes for a record of some kind, a record saying that on this day, at that time, in this place, X came into the world. Why? Because it feels proper. For me, I was born in a military hospital in Plattsburgh, New York. When I asked my father about it, he told me where the place was located in the town, how it was 2 weeks early, and that I was so ready to be born, I almost made my entrance in the hospital parking lot. Finding paper on the lives of the enslaved are much more precarious. Slave narratives usually begin along the lines of, I was born around this date, or I don't have a real record to say exactly when I was born. It's part of the process of dehumanization, the denial of documentation. Suzanne Simone Baptiste was no different. There are no records that I have found so far of the date of her birth, which has been listed anywhere from 1742 to 1753. What I found more telling when I started doing archival work is that I do know where she was born, because she was born at the Breda plantation, because her birth denoted property and therefore wealth for her owners. This type of dismissal and dehumanization for Suzanne followed me into my dive into the archives. So I'll give you a little bit about the history of Suzanne in a minute, but I wanted to show you, this is the ship's log of the Louverture family coming into France. You'll see Toussaint Louverture up top, his valet, and then you see Suzanne listed only as the spouse of Toussaint, while her boys all have their names, Isaac, Placide, and Jean. And so when you look at this, it's often easy to be dismissive and say, I guess Suzanne doesn't have any stories that she can tell. But what I realized is that there are actually multiple stories to tell about Suzanne, some that others managed to tell about her in spite of what was true. And we can't ignore the lies that are told about her, because I think they help us unpack why I ultimately think Suzanne was so important. And I also think that the lies are symptomatic of larger ideas about her. So what I've found in writing about Suzanne is that there are more than the fragments that Marissa Fuentes talked about in the mutilated fragments of Black women in the archives. In the case of Suzanne, much more than fragments. There are a lot more had anybody bothered to look for her. And as a historian, it puts me on alert to how easy it is to expunge a person from the historical record. And Suzanne is often listed in the archives, in fact, to talk about something or someone else as an object to be moved about, a nuisance to be managed, or a problem to be solved. And so I want to show you some of the images that I have found during my research, because part of the job for me is how to separate the nonsense about Suzanne from what is actually factual, right? And if we return to how I talked about in the very beginning about the sort of opaqueness of Black women's lives and the blatant disregard of their lives, we need to sort of look at these images and figure out what story somebody else is trying to tell. And so I want you to pay attention not only to where she, as usually the only women in these images, show up, but what she's doing and how they want her to be represented. So this first image is called Toussaint Louverture reading a book. This next image is called Toussaint Louverture with wife being reunited with children. This one is called Toussaint Louverture with wife and children being seized by the French. And this last one is Suzanne parting from his wife and children. We'll come back to that. What my research has actually shown is that Suzanne is much more than merely the wife of someone else. So this is what I know so far. She was born enslaved, not sure the date. Don't know her parents. She had at least one sister and one brother, and an uncle who could have been her father, might have been another brother. She was married or coupled at least twice, once to a man of mixed race, and that produces her oldest son, Placide, and potentially a daughter. And then second to Haitian revolutionary Toussaint Louverture. We know that she grew up on the Breda plantation in Saint-Domingue and would ultimately be kidnapped with her family in 1802 and brought to France, where she and her boys became the pawns of the French government. Okay. And so, not surprisingly, with this job, one of the first things I wanted to do was see if I could create a family tree. And I want you to have a hard time reading this for a reason. And that is, Suzanne is in this little yellow box. And so when I was working with my researchers, I asked them, see how much you can find for me. And if you look to your left, most of the people below Suzanne are the illegitimate children that Suzanne's second husband, Toussaint, had during their marriage, right? And so the reason I show this image is because when I was developing this family tree with my researchers, they kept sending this to me, and I kept getting very frustrated because I said, you know, that little square is getting really, really lost on the page. And how do I make her the most important topic? But it also became a metaphor for me because most of the family tree on here is Toussaint Louverture's, and that's usually the person that people care about. And what I wanted to do was I wanted Suzanne to stand out. I wanted to make her bigger because for me, she was the story. And I realized when I zeroed in on Suzanne, I realized a number of things. One of them is that the line of Suzanne actually continues to this day. And it's not because of Toussaint, it's because of her oldest son. So the surviving line of the Louverture family is Suzanne's. And so what I decided to do is that I realized when I was looking at the archives that Suzanne sort of burst into what I call historical visibility five or six times in her life. Her enslavement in Saint-Domingue, the family's kidnapping to France, being held captive for the first time in a small naval port, then moving moving down the coast to a small city called Bayonne, and then moved inland to be dumped in Agen. And I'll talk about that last one in a minute. And so when I started this research, I thought if I was lucky, I would have maybe 10 documents. And I didn't know if that was enough to be able to try to create a life. I also didn't know if Suzanne could write or if she could read. And if she could write, did she leave documentation? And so it's interesting to me now that I'm close to 100 documents. Like Suzanne's all over the archives. It's hilarious to me that biographers of Toussaint Louverture have said, we can't write about her. She's left nothing. So here's one of the nothings she left. This is Suzanne writing a letter aboard the ship that I showed you the log for earlier when she and the family had been kidnapped. You can see her name at the top, Suzanne Toussaint Louverture. And what she says is in this letter, she's writing to the Minister of the Navy about the family's kidnapping. She says, allow a sorry wife, a mother of a family, to claim for you the benevolence and generosity of the French government. If my weak voice could be heard from you, it will be a great consolation to me. I will have a favor to ask of you, citizen minister, that of granting me permission to return to Saint-Domingue, or if you did not consider it suitable, to write to General Leclerc to make me reach my business. I have already written to him in this regard, but since we had left, he couldn't answer me. I left home without having taken anything, only a few spare parts and 21 gourds, which is monetary currency. Commander Pisquidu witnessed it. He himself gave me a receipt. Citizen minister, judge what my position is. Without laundry and without money, what would become of me? Women, you know, don't get involved in men's affairs. I have nothing to do with all of this. Citizen minister, I await your response in the greatest submission and hope for all the benevolence and leniency of the French government. And what we do know from this is, unlike her use of rhetoric to get what she needs, Suzanne very much was involved in the affairs of the Haitian Revolution. And she wrote to some of the most important actors during that revolution with an expectation that they would write her back. And oftentimes they didn't. So one of the chapters that was listed on the slide that I just showed you was called Violence and Myth Making in France. And so when I was working on the first book, I thought Suzanne was going to be a chapter. I'm really happy that she's not now, because I think she's worthy of a complete biography in really particular ways. But there was a reason why I stopped. And that is I came across a newspaper clipping that suggested that Suzanne had been tortured at the hands of Napoleon. And I had been working on sort of the humiliation and degradation of the Black women that I was studying for a really long time. And when I came across this torture narrative, it sort of brought me to my knees, and I needed to stop. And although I'm about 95% sure that this torture never happened, what I realized was that my body was acting as if it did happen. And then I came across this image that that you see right now, and I said, I have to wait. So what I'm finding in the sources is that although many of the actors who are writing in the 19th century don't find Suzanne compelling, I do. I find her absolutely fascinating. And even though her husband sometimes perpetuates different kinds of narratives about her, what I have found is that Suzanne is politically astute. She was a landowner who very problematically also most likely owned slaves, that she was ferociously devoted to her children in her church, that she conveyed information and created information about what was happening during the Haitian Revolution, sometimes to the chagrin of her husband. And what I've also found is dozens of documents from the French government speaking about how unimportant she is and how unworthy she is of their time. that Napoleon is briefed often on what Suzanne is doing and where she is and how she's behaving. And what I've also found is that she was written about in Haiti, in France, in England, in India, and through the United States. So one of my other researchers when I was working, told me when she was doing this research how sick she was of the government documents she was finding because they all kept disrespecting Suzanne. And it was a few minutes later that she realized that in their effort to erase Suzanne, they actually brought her into historical focus. And that despite attempting to erase her, that Suzanne existed in her own right, and there are glimpses of her everywhere. And by uncovering her life story, what I've tried to do and what I'm trying to do in this work is highlight the particular perspective of colonial history, but one where colonial power meets up against resistance, recentered in the body of a Black woman as a historical figure in her own right. And what I realized, instead of killing her like they ultimately do to her husband, France moves her about for decades because she's incredibly dangerous. And by the time they realize she's so dangerous that they have to kill her, it's too late to do so. And so what they will attempt to do is starve her to death, and it doesn't work. And so I wanted to show you, as I'm sort of finishing up here, different ways that I'm trying to re-articulate the family tree of Suzanne. One where she is at the center, where I think she belongs. And I think that the challenges of the archives are real. I think they're created by people who assign importance to certain data. And that despite often seemingly being dedicated to eliminate people who look like me, that in many ways, sometimes the archives reveal us. Not in ways that are almost always pleasant, but that we are there. And that our job is to attempt to make meaning. So I've worked really hard in the work that I do not to ascribe thoughts and feelings to the women that I study unless I have enough evidence that it's appropriate for me to speculate, right? Because I think there are places where historians can make good guesses based on solid historical analysis. And so I want to end today with the beginning of the book, which is my attempt not to write the perspective and the nonsense of just the historical documents, but to turn this space around and try to write what Suzanne would have seen and known. So I end today with the beginning of my book. Suzanne walked by dead bodies all the time. No one knows how many, as if the actual numbers mattered at the end of the day. She saw acts of murder all the time. If corporal punishment was the law of the land and mutilated corpses were common in the various squares, she would have been unable to avoid the consequences of French power. She recognized the spectacle of death because death was the spectacle the French wanted Blacks to internalize all the time. Heads carelessly removed and mounted upon pikes, mouths gaping open as if the exact moment of death was still a surprise. One wonders if Suzanne steeled herself each time she passed another broken Black body, bearing witness to its rotting flesh and putrid smell, or if she refused to flinch, knowing eyes, including the dead to whom she paid silent tribute, were upon her. She might have suspected that if anyone saw her, they would look at her to understand how to behave. But public feelings were dangerous to the enslaved. One grieves in private. Thank you. So I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, you can hear me?
Yes, let me turn up my, yes.
That's incredibly powerful. Incredibly powerful. I have a page full of questions, but what I'll do is I'll turn it over to those present in the room, and I see hands going up already, so we will start with one.
Hi, I just want to start by saying I'm a huge fan of your work. I'm a
Thank
history
you.
major, and I just recently completed a fellowship where I was going into archives and looking for stories about Black women, and it was such a draining process. And I was
Mhm.
wondering, like, how do you stay encouraged, and how do you kind of look beyond the narratives that are immediately presented?
Yeah, solidarity. I don't know how one does not get discouraged. Because oftentimes the archivists don't see what you're looking for either. And that's really, really hard. But I think for me, the thing that keeps me going is that I'm in service to these women, and that my frustration, while it matters to me, doesn't matter. Right. And so like I keep images of the women that I study if I have them around me all the time, because it reminds me of the work that we do. And that the work that we do is in service to something more important than ourselves. Right. I also spend as much time as I can practicing as much self-care as I can. I know for many of us who do this work, we see terrible images, we read terrible stories, and you know, they can break you, and they often do. Which is why I told the story about coming across that image. I just said, you know what, I can't do this anymore. And then I realized, yeah, Suzanne deserves more than sort of the pity party that I'm giving myself right now. But part of the work we do is bigger than the work and the toll that it takes on us. And so I just try to be really mindful of that. I also do this work and am able to do this work because of the faces that I can see in this small square that I'm talking, while I'm talking, is that in many ways, these were the stories I really needed when I was a student. And so now I try to write them.
Thank you. All right, any other questions from the room?
I want to thank you first for presenting amazing presentation. And
Thank you.
something that I've struggled with is not necessarily justifying, but being able to communicate why this research is so important, specifically looking into like the history of Black women, especially in European countries.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder how you fight back against people invalidating like your work, like for example saying that there were no Black people in France, but more than that, that this history isn't like rich enough to be able to delve into, and it's not worth it to publish.
One of the ways I did that was in the preface of the book. I was very clear in the preface about sort of why, how hard this work was. When I was a student, I knew that Black people mattered in French history, even though I couldn't always articulate why. It took me a really long time to be able to articulate why. And part of it was, you're absolutely right, feeling that I had to justify this work, and I don't do that anymore. Like, the interesting thing for me is when I first started doing this work, people said, how many Black people are in France? And so I got the statistics, and it was like 0.25% of the population. And the first response I got back was, that's not enough. That's not critical mass. So that doesn't work. And what I realized is there's a difference between the actual number of Black women that are in France in the 19th century and the rhetorical importance of those bodies, right? Which means that's not predicated on how many people there are. It's predicated on how many white people seem to be using those bodies to tell all different kinds of stories, to relieve all kinds of tensions, right? In that case, The number doesn't matter, right? And I often realized that all of these famous white people that traditional French historians were interested in had interactions with the women that I study, which means if you don't talk about the importance of those women, you don't have a full portrait of the white people that you think are so important, right? And so part of this was me saying, for those of you who think you study 19th century France, it doesn't look the way you think it does. And sometimes these people didn't behave in the ways that you think they did, right? And so what I realized is if you look at all of the political changes that are happening in France between like 1789 and 1848, there are multiple political sort of regimes and monarchies. Slavery stays relatively consistent. And so what happens if you look at that consistency and bump it up against all of these political moments, that you see something different happening? The women that I study in the first book pop up at these really interesting moments of political crisis, right? You don't see that if you don't care about those people. And so part of this was sort of me stepping back and saying, I don't need to justify why these women are important. These women are important. Like the fact that the chief of police of Paris thinks he needs to tell Napoleon Bonaparte that this seemingly inconsequential woman is sort of, that there's a rumor about her, suggests to me this woman is more important than maybe other people thought she was, right? And so part of it, first, I'll tell you, stop justifying the work that you do. The work you do is important. People are going to get it or not get it, but that doesn't make the work not important. And so that helped me move from the first book to the second book, where I thought, I'm not going to be able to see this woman, I'm not going to be able to visualize her. There's not going to be documents. And then having 100 documents in front of me. And 100 documents that keep saying, she's not very important. And I'm like, she's living rent-free in your head right now for somebody who's not very important, right? And so it's given me a lot of courage to just do my work.
Thank you.
I want to follow up with a question because at one point you said Suzanne was dangerous to them. So, why was she dangerous to them?
You know, I think it's really interesting. Once the family is kidnapped, they spend a month at sea. And the family is under heavy surveillance. And then they come into this naval port called Brest.
Yeah, Brest.
And Toussaint is almost immediately separated from his family. They get like one brief moment to say goodbye to one another, and he's taken off to a prison where they will ultimately murder him, right? And the belief is he's tortured because there's a belief that the family has hidden money and treasures in the mountains during the revolution in Saint-Domingue, right? Right. And so after, I think right now what my thought, like I'm still writing this book, so like everything I'm telling you could just be a lie. But right now what I'm thinking and what I'm seeing is when Toussaint is murdered, she becomes his proxy. And so if they can't figure out from him where these treasures are, I believe some folks start thinking they can find that information out from her. And so there's an attempt, I think, to sort of freeze the family, the remaining family, to death. She just doesn't die. And so they move her and two of her sons to Bayonne. And then what starts happening is immigrants from the revolution start coming to pay homage to her. And so they pretend that she tried to escape to get back, and they move her again to the place where she will ultimately live for about a decade. And during that time, the thing that I love about Suzanne is she just won't shut up. She just starts writing letters. Where's my other son? Why can't I have him? Where's my husband? Like, you guys aren't giving us enough to survive on. And so there is a power that by the time they realize we really need to get rid of this woman, that torture narrative comes out. And one of the arguments that I think I'm making in this book was I moved from being horrified by this narrative to starting to wonder if she didn't release it herself, because that torture narrative keeps her alive for another 8 years until she dies. And so there is so much happening with one, thinking Suzanne doesn't really matter. And so just sort of moving her aside to realizing this woman is a conduit for a lot of other things. And the white French realizing that too late.
Okay, thank you. I have two other questions, but I'm going to hold off. I can talk to you. I can get you another time.
I was going to say, girl, we can talk on the phone.
For real. So, yeah.
Hi, Dr. Mitchell. I just want to say you had a really great presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I wanted to know if you knew any like resources or if you had any tips for people who are looking to like try to find archives of maybe their own family or their own history, because like I've been trying to, and like because my history is definitely like related to France because I'm from Cameroon, so like I wanted to know like if you knew of any resources or any tips from people.
It's so shameful to me that the research I do, I can't even find my own family. I keep saying I need to become famous so I can be on Finding Your Roots so they can find my family tree, because that's the only way that's going to happen. It's really interesting. When I first started doing research, I couldn't come up with anything. I couldn't find anything. And that's because I didn't know the language that the French were using. You can't walk into an archive and say, I study Black women. They look at you like you're an alien. And so I needed to figure out how Black people were being talked about. And in the late 18th and early 19th century, that's usually through the archives of slavery, right? And so I have found more documents on the book on Suzanne right now, looking at naval documents than I ever thought possible. Like if you had told me I was going to be reading ship's logs, I would have laughed at you. But the amount of information that I'm finding in ship's logs have been really, really important, right? The other thing for me is I needed to articulate in my own mind sort of how white French people viewed Black people. And once I realized that many in the archives, they're often viewed as problems to be solved. And so I moved to police archives. And again, Black people started showing up there, not because Black people are a problem, but because white French people were talking about them as if they were a problem and then reporting them for surveillance, right? And so it's sort of a question like and then here's the other thing that's happened in France, is that France has moved all of its colonial archives out of Paris. They've moved them to the south of France. You can read into that whatever you want to. But most archives that are talking about Black people are found in the colonial archives. And so I'm having much better luck looking at colonial archives than I did looking at the so-called big traditional French archives. And the other part for me is that because of slavery, there's a lot of chatter about Black people in port cities where those ships came in. And so again, once I sort of moved out of Paris proper and moved to like Nantes, Bordeaux, La Rochelle, I started seeing stories about Black people a lot more than I did in the traditional archives. So like, I'm happy to pass things along, but like, as you know, we're often listed not by name, by sex, by color, and by age. And so it makes this work really, really hard. which is why the women that I study sort of, like I said, burst into a kind of historical visibility, and that generates paper. And so I'm able to take advantage of the fact that lots of people are talking about a particular person.
Before I take questions from the room, I just want to read some comments online. Ann Taylor, inspirational presentation, thank you.
Thank you.
Sophia Senyo, I am so grateful for Dr. Robin's purpose and work and keeping and sharing this knowledge so it's not lost. Betty Ann McNeil says, I appreciate the insights from your presentation. Have you studied Francophone women who left Saint Dominique for safety in Baltimore after the Haitian Revolution?
Not in Baltimore, although, like I said, I've started looking at ship's logs, and I was following this guy. I don't even want to say his name because he's an idiot, but he was sort of famous. And he had a relationship with a Black woman and ended up having a child with her. And then he got married to a white woman, and had a son by him. And during the Haitian Revolution, puts them all on a ship and brings them to Philadelphia. And so I've been following his journey. Well, I'm not actually following his journey. I'm using his journey to talk about his so-called Black concubine and their daughter, right? And so during the revolution, folks are getting on ships and going any number of places in the United States. I just happen to be sort of interested in Philadelphia because that's where that happens. So no, I don't follow Baltimore. And, you know, my main focus is what happens to folks from Saint-Domingue when they hit France proper. And so I'm not even studying folks that end up in other French colonies. For me, as a French historian, they enter interest for me in very particular ways when those women, in my case, actually hit French soil.
Yes, thanks. And Pamela Knight, thanks also. You said amazing presentation. Thank you for bringing Madame Louverture's life into focus. So let me turn to the room. Okay, Micaiah? And then Wiki.
There might be a better way to phrase this, but I'm going to spit it out, and then we can work from there.
There you go.
As a historian and an archivist, how do you navigate things like geographical changes? So, like, there were spaces, lands, and things like that that existed that are no longer called that, or nations that are new nations have formed and fallen. So how do you navigate that when you're going through these documents and you're reading about lands and boundaries that no longer exist in our modern language?
You know, I almost always now, and this was, you know, I did my graduate work at Berkeley, and one of the best lessons I got is I almost always have a piece of paper next to me when I'm reading, and I'm always writing names that are unfamiliar or how spaces are talked about, and literally keep sort of a chart where I go, okay, in 18 whatever, that name changes to this. So I keep a working glossary with me all the time. It's the same as when I'm writing about women. Most of the women that I write about, only their first name, if that is listed. And so I may end up with 47 Sarahs. And I don't know which Sarahs they are, right? And so all I can do sometimes is acknowledge that I found this many women, or I think I found this many women. These are the names I found. These are the occupations I can find, even if it's just a sliver of information. But part of the archival process is trying to make sense out of sometimes the nonsensical, and sometimes I can't follow the trail. I can't follow the geographic trail. I can't follow the name trail. I can't follow these people. Sometimes these folks appear and they disappear, and it makes me sort of heartsick because I can't write about them. but there's not enough material to be able to form, right? But part of our jobs as scholars is we do our best to keep track of these names and these spaces, and that we are very clear when that trail becomes murky. The documents are the document. For me as a historian, it was very, a historian that's also like trained in Black feminist thought and deeply engaged in the lives of Black people. There is sometimes a contradiction between the stories that survive and archival documents, right? And which of those things people take seriously. I take it all seriously, but sometimes we lose the trail. And I think it's okay to say so, and sad at the same time. I know that's not a very satisfying answer.
One last question from Whitley.
Well, it's not really a question, it's more so a comment.
Okay.
I was just going to say, well, two things. Kanye Ben said that there's niggas in Paris, but nobody really listens to Kanye because of the way that he articulates himself sometimes. But to have this information in terms of just like the historical context of Black women, but especially Black people, but especially Black women. As a Black woman, it really just kind of, I want to say, touched me in a sense, because when you start paying attention to social issues, and I'm an ABD major, and being able to see just the way that it connects. One of the critiques that I gave my professors is when we learn Black history or Black liberation, it's always men at the forefront.
Exactly.
Question like, where are Black women? What are Black women doing? And just some of the things that you've given in your presentation has really, I don't know, in a feminist way, spoke to that aspect, where that fire comes from, how these stereotypes about Black women become into play, about us being emasculating, or the voices that we do find because of, our certain oppression. So I just wanted to say, as a Black woman who's studying ABD, to see and hear that there are other Black women who use their talents and resources to write about these women is, I don't know, it kind of it's emotional, I guess.
Yes, I know. Thank you.
I'm glad that God has used you to move past like your emotional feelings, but to be able to produce this so that other Black women can understand like who they are and just walk in their power.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Look, when I first started doing this work, I honestly, thank you. I'm very moved by that. When I first started doing this work, literally when I wrote my book, I thought 4 people would buy it. And 2 of them would be my parents. And that nobody would care about these women and their rather extraordinary lives. And so I am so humbled and grateful by how seriously you all take their lives, that I get to share those things, and that it creates a very particular kind of historical memory. And so I'm very, very grateful for all of you, and the fact that you have now taken these women in their lives, and that you'll continue to take them with you. I'm really grateful. Thank you.
We are looking forward to your powerful book when it comes out. Thank you so much.
Suzanne is trying to kill me.
I've been telling you that she needed you to do this, so you're doing it. All right.
Thank you all.
Bye. Have a good day.